I want to talk to you today about counsel. I've entitled this, Be Careful Who You Listen to. Now, when we are faced with a difficult decision, we often ask others what they would do, and that makes sense. If it's a health issue, you consult with a doctor who may in turn send you to a specialist. If it's a financial concern, you may want to talk with your banker or a tax consultant or your financial advisor or an accountant. If you're buying a home, you might talk to friends, a local realtor, look at real estate magazines. If you're thinking about college, you might talk to your parents or someone who graduated from the college, an alumnus, or go through the deluge of college catalogs. If it's a major purchase, you might do some comparison shopping, go online, check out the latest copy of Consumer Magazine. So the question I pose to us is this: how do we know what they are saying is worth listening to? How do we determine if we should listen to them in the first place? Can we blame them if their advice is bad? Do I have any personal responsibility in seeking guidance? The passage before us in 1 Kings chapter 12 provides 7 guidelines that will help promote our ability to hear from God as He may use others in our lives from time to time. Let's take a look at the historical background. In chapter 11, verses 41 to 43, it says, Now the rest of the acts of Solomon and whatever he did, and his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the acts of Solomon? Thus, the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of his father David, and his son Rehoboam reigned in his place. Well, what do we know about the closing years of Solomon's life? Well, in chapter 11, verse 1, it says, Now King Solomon loved many foreign women along with the daughters of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the sons of Israel, You shall not associate with them, nor shall they associate with you, for they will surely turn your heart away after their God. And Solomon held fast to these loves. Well, the closing years of Solomon's life, he loved foreign women. Often this would have been a political or military alliance. They turned his heart away from serving the one true God, so he was involved in idolatry. It clearly says in verse 2 that his heart was distracted. He had competitors for the worship of Jehovah God with these other gods. And the latter years of his leadership was harsh. It was a self-centered leadership, and we'll discover that in a moment when Jeroboam comes back to Rehoboam after Solomon's death. Solomon in his early career gave counsel that glorified God and benefited those that he rules. You read earlier in the book of Kings and then the cross-reference in Chronicles, he made many, many wise decisions that demonstrated the wisdom of God. Also, Proverbs records a lot of his wisdom. But he was not always self-seeking. Only when his heart became distracted did his idols of selfishness drive him to use people instead of serving people. Some of his downfalls, he collected gold and horses, which God said not to do. The emptiness of his life is recorded in the book of Ecclesiastes. He had external problems with the king of Edom and Arab. He had internal problems. Jeroboam, commander of the forced labor, and the prophetic word of Ahijah in chapter 11, verse 29. Rehoboam having to pick up the pieces of the wicked reign of Solomon and men hiding from him. According to Proverbs chapter 28, verse 12, it gives a description of the people under the reign of a bad ruler. Proverbs 28, verse 12 says, when the righteous triumph, there is great glory, but when the wicked rise, men hide themselves. And that's what Jeroboam did. He fled, taking many, many people with him. And we will see that after Solomon dies, Jeroboam comes back to Rehoboam. You got to keep your boam straight. Came back to Rehoboam, who was the heir to the throne, and we will see his request. We will see what Rehoboam does, and we'll see the disaster of it. Now, here are the 7 principles. Number 1, clearly identify the problem. In 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 4, Jeroboam comes back and he's talking to Rehoboam, and he says, your father made our yoke hard. Now, therefore, lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke, which he put on us, and we will serve you. Verse 9. So he said to them, what counsel do you give me that we may answer this people who have spoken to me, saying, lighten the yoke which your father put on him? That's referring to the council of the elders that served his father. Too often when we are trying to identify the problem, it's running through the grid of our feelings, and that presents difficulty in identifying the primary issue. We get sidetracked on secondary issues. The problems are based in this story on the facts that can be verified. It was a heavy yoke that was placed upon the people, and Jeroboam revolted. It's important that we clearly identify the problem. That will help us to quickly implement solutions. The second, take time to consult counsel. Verse 5, after Jeroboam comes to Rehoboam and said, hey, look, lighten up the load here and we'll come and serve you. In verse 5, Rehoboam says, depart for 3 days, then return to me. So the people departed. And the rest of the next couple of verses, he consults with counsel. You know, you and I live in a breakneck society, a fast-paced world telling us we need to make instant, snap, immediate decisions. Decide now. High-pressure sales tactics, creating an impulsive atmosphere. Rash decisions are harmful. For example, when Nabal reneged on his covenant agreement with David, who was watching his herdsmen and the sheep, and he came to collect the annual fee, Nabal says, I don't know who you are. There's so many runaway slaves nowadays. That was said to two people that David sent to collect. And when they came back, David was irate, and he strapped on his sword, and he was going to wipe out every male in Nabal's family. Now, he didn't do it because Abigail stepped in. But the point that we're trying to understand here, rash decisions can create very harmful situations. In Proverbs chapter 14, verse 15, it says this, Proverbs 14:15, the naive believes everything, but the sensible man considers his step. Naive person believes everything because it's a quick decision. It's an emotional decision. It's a decision based on feelings. And then in Proverbs chapter 18, verse 13, it says this: he who gives an answer before he hears, it is folly and shame to him. And then in verse 17 of the same chapter, the first to plead his case seems right until another comes and examines him. Number 3, seek counsel from sources who are knowledgeable. In verse 6, King Rehoboam consulted with the elders who had served his father Solomon while he was still alive, saying, how do you counsel me to answer this people? And they spoke to him, saying, if you will be a servant to this people, and will serve them and grant them their petition, and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever. In verse 9, he is talking. Let's pick up verse 8. But he forsook the counsel of the elders which they had given him, and consulted with the young men who grew up with him and served him. And he said to them, what do you counsel me to do with this people? Lighten their load which my father put on them. And the young men who grew up with him said to him, thus you shall say to this people, your father made our yoke heavy, now make it lighter for us. But you shall speak to them, my little finger is thicker than my father's loins. And so he was going to be more harsh than his fathers. Multiple counselors was a common practice in the Old Testament, both in the secular world and with sacred kings. You see this with David and Nebuchadnezzar. Kings knew the tendency to have yes men as advisors. Multitude of counselors are recorded in scriptures. In Proverbs chapter 11, verse 14, where there is no guidance, the people fall, but in abundance of counselor there is victory. In chapter 15, verse 22, the same words are echoed. Without consultation, plans are frustrated, but with many counselors, they succeed. And then in chapter 24, verse 6, it says, for by wise guidance you will wage war, and in an abundance of counselors there is victory. Now, the advantage of older counsel is they're closest to the situation with first-hand knowledge. They often appeal to biblical concept of servanthood that we see in this story. They're gentle, seeking unification. Now, the disadvantage of older counsel, supposedly, is their age, perception of not understanding, being out of touch with the times, the counsel being irrelevant as people look at them. Advantage of younger counsel, supportive of preconceived ideas of the person that they're supposedly counseling. They have energy and vitality to support the plan, strength to carry it out. They will often simply be yes people. The disadvantage, they're oftentimes assertive, bold, and brash. They'll be involved with manipulative practices and use intimidation. They only saw one dimension of the problem in this story, lighten their yokes. The counsel was divisive. It was not unifying. There was a hidden agenda of self-seeking, and they violated basically Proverbs 27:6, faithful are the wounds of a friend. They did not give counsel because the counsel might offend Rehoboam, and then they would be out of the elite circle. Number 4, be honest and open and teachable when seeking counsel. Verse 8, he is looking for counsel. But we need to avoid the pitfalls of seeking counsel until you hear what you want to hear, affirming your sinful desires. See, that's what he did. He had counsel from the older men who served Solomon. They had firsthand knowledge of Solomon and the twists in Solomon's life and what caused that. But he didn't like the counsel and he rejected it because he wasn't hearing what he wanted to hear. He wanted to establish himself as a better king than his dad. And then filter all counsel through your grid of discernment. In chapter 12, verse 10 and 11, the young men who grew up with him spoke to him, telling him that he needs to be tougher than his father, and so he comes across that way. Rehoboam knew his father's rule violated God's ordinances, multiple women, collecting of horses and gold. The older council confirmed that in their council he needed to be a servant, as Solomon was when he first began. Now, there's two filtering systems that we see in this story and that we experience in life: human reasoning and then biblical discernment. Biblical discernment will cross-cut our preconceived ideas of what we want. Human reasoning can set biblical discernment aside, like a box up in a closet that is collecting dust. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, trust in the Lord with all of your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. Psalm 119, verse 24 says this. Psalm 119, verse 24 gives this supporting. Your testimonies also are my delight. They are my counselors. Number 6, be prepared to live with your decision. Be prepared to live with your decision. In verse 12, then Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam on the third day, as the king had directed, saying, return to me on the third day. The king answered the people harshly, for he forsook the advice of the elders which they had given him, and he spoke to them according to the advice of the younger men, saying, my father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, I will discipline you with scorpions. So the king did not listen to the people, for it was a turn of events from the Lord that he might establish his word, which he spoke through Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. And you would have to take a look at 1 Kings chapter 11 about that. Be prepared to live with the decision. Negative results may be derived from godless decisions. Now, what happened here? Well, Jeroboam revolted and took 10 tribes to the north. They would become known as Israel. Rehoboam had 2 tribes, and he would be in the south. He would have Benjamin and Judah. Jeroboam would set up a rival worship service, similar to what a traditional Jew would participate in down in Jerusalem. He did that trying to prevent people from returning to Jerusalem and offering their annual sacrifices and seeing, boy, things have really changed here. It's kind of nice. I think I'll stay here. And the ongoing results of a godless decision violating conscience and counsel. If the decision is based on God's word, it is not a wrong decision just because people don't like the decision or you. You can have the favor of men now or the favor of God later. And then finally, the sovereignty of God is involved in all the decisions. Verse 15 said it was a turn of events from the Lord, because this had been prophesied by the prophet Ahijah that this was going to take place. Whether the decision is godly or ungodly, God permits it. At times, ungodly decisions are used of God to affirm his revelation or work out an aspect of his will. This is where God can take all things and work them out for good. However, it does not mean that we can disregard biblical principles of decision making and wise counsel and cast out presumptuous fate onto the sovereignty of God. In other words, we can't set aside godly counsel, biblical principles, and just make presumptuous decisions that God is going to use it for our good. Let's summarize here. As we think about counsel, I don't know who you turn to. I don't know who you text, who you call, who you email. But here are some questions if they say, if you ask them for their counsel. Whom will the counsel glorify? Is the counsel going to glorify self or God? Whom will the counsel benefit? Self or others? What will the counsel do? Is it going to unite or divide? And then what is the counsel based upon? Service or seeking of power? There are additional teachings available at this blog spot. I trust that you might go and visit. There is a lengthy, I think about 10 or 11 part series on knowing the will of God. There is a 3-part series on developing a strong spiritual life. There are other recordings there on is God fair? How do we deal with the sinfulness of man and God's justice? Some good things there for your personal growth and putting in your tool bag that you might be able to help others.